Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Fuente and Meerapfel presents Meet the Professor. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hey. Hello, everyone.
Greetings.
Hello. Today we have a very, very, very special guest of honor. He is a gentleman. He is one of the finest palates in our industry. He is a monument with a cigar aficionado, the one and only Mr. George Brightman. George, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you guys. Thanks very much.
Well, we're looking forward to getting on your back today. But in the meantime, Professor, what's on your plate?
Listen, first of all, it's great to be back on the show. Hope everybody is safe. I think I heard Carlito, but you know, sometimes we hear, where's Carlito? But I guess he's around. Today we have a special guest, but not only a special guest, a longtime friend of mine. He's been a longtime friend of your family too, Jeremiah. And of course, Carlito and George Brightman go back many, many years ago. Today, George and probably Carlito will talk about some things about Project X, maybe not. I think they're interesting, but today we're gonna have a great show. George, it's a privilege, an honor. We've been friends for many years. We talk a lot, we keep in touch a lot, and you're one of the good guys. How are you?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here and happy to share some time with you guys. I'm a big fan of what you've been doing so far. I've really enjoyed it. And so I want to say, keep up the good work. Jeremiah, you're a terrific ringleader.
Well, listen, you've just started off very well. I appreciate you very much, George. George, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yes, George, welcome on board, man. It's been
Hey, my brother, how are you? It's really good to see you.
great, man. I'm great. It's good to see you, bro. Good to see you. Long time.
Yeah, too long. But that's the price we pay for this safety. You know, that's why I sort of cleaned up. I wanted to be quarantine clean as opposed to quarantine caveman.
Absolutely, man. It's the best thing you can do.
Well, listen, most people out there, of course, know George Brightman. George is a household name. George is part of the famous and the icons of our industry. But for the few people out there, George, who may not have had the privilege of discovering you, why don't you give them a few words on your history, your involvement with the industry, and get them up to speed?
Okay. I'll tell you this. I started in the retail end of the cigar business and working in a tobacco shop, as we called them then, in 1973. Shortly after that is when I met Carlito's dad, along with Fred Zanaboni, another great legend, may he rest in peace. Beautiful guy. But I worked in the retail business in Washington, D.C., Georgetown Tobacco for over 10 years. And I left Washington to move to New York City to open the Davidoff retail business in the United States. And that led to some extraordinary times, but also great exposure to a key time in the Dominican Republic, late 80s. What was happening there was extraordinary, and it was the flowering of culture. I think, Carlito, you...
No sound. I lost sound.
George, we've lost sound on you. If you can hear us, we lost sound on you. All right.
The last 30 seconds.
Me and Gordon Mott. And I did that for over a decade. I put the 10th anniversary issue of the magazine, which no one said was going to survive. I put the 10th anniversary of the magazine in the rearview mirror and decided to move on to do some other things. Probably a big mistake, if I think about it. But I went back. I was part of the launch of Xeno Platinum, which was another big movement in the business, and I operated a private cigar lounge, a membership cigar lounge that Carlito knows very well because both he and his dad and Cynthia were all
maybe in a bad way.
Sound.
There seems to be a little bit of a technical issue with
I'm losing
the
sound.
sound on George's side. In the meantime, we're going to go back up to you.
I've run cigar bars.
All right.
Anyway, that's a little bit.
George's network is low. That's what it's saying. Your network is low on your internet, George.
I'm sorry. What, am I breaking up? Are you losing audio or video?
We're
Losing
audio.
audio. We're losing audio.
I'll tell you what, talk amongst yourselves for a minute. Let me see if I can move where I have a better connection.
All right, excellent. Thank you, George. In the meantime, we're going to ask you, Professor, to give us a bit of an update on George. You know him very, very well. You've known him for many, many years, and I know he's a good friend of yours. So why don't you fill us in a bit, Jose?
Look, George Brightman, and it's funny because Carlito and I have talked about him a lot, probably has one of the best palates. Let's say outside of the people within the industry, I would say that George Brightman probably has, I'm going to put him as one of the top 3 in the United States and one of the top all over the world. George Brightman is a person that has smoked cigars for many, many years. He's been involved in the business, but he's been always very open-minded. And sometimes when George and I start talking about tobacco, it's not that he's going to talk about one brand or one country or this. George Brightman will go into details because he's been in Cuba, he's been in DR, he's been in Nicaragua, he's been in Honduras. He's been all over the place. And he has, I would say, a worldwide view of tobaccos and companies and things like that. And I think that Carlito could give some notes. I know we're going to be talking a lot with George about this, but Carlito could fill us in on some things with George also, because George is, I got some stories I'm going to tell later on when George is on that are just amazing.
No, absolutely, George. While you were gone, Jose was giving them a brief overview of your life and your experience, that you've been in every factory in the world and all the countries, and that no one has the experience that you have, and he gave you a huge compliment. He says of all the people that he's met, that you have one of the most refined and the best palates in the cigar world. And I don't know if you heard that. If you're hearing us, George, are you there?
I can hear you now. Yes, I'm sorry. I apologize. I was just trying to get.
I like that, man. You look good now. There you go. You look like the king you are. Jose, I second that, absolutely. George and I go back to the 70s when I used to call him at night. And
Yep.
Fred told me, listen, I met the most interesting man. All he does is ask questions. This is number, give him a call. And I remember that night, I used to call him from the Tampa factory at night, and we used to speak about Nicaragua. He used to ask me about ligero and about fermentation. It was just like nonstop. And
Yeah.
it was at a time when nobody would ask those questions, or anybody even knew what those terms were if you were outside the industry. And it was very impressive. But I don't know if George even knows this, but his knowledge is so vast that he has a nickname. You know what your nickname is, George Brightman?
No, tell me. Uh-oh. Yeah, well.
And you know who? Yeah, you know who nicknamed you the Pope.
Well, I think we're talking about Enrico, right? We're talking about Enrico Barone.
Yes, Enrico Barone.
God bless him.
The Pope, absolutely. God bless him. He was a very dear friend. I met him through George Brightman. As a matter of fact, you're talking about palate. I'm going to share something that's probably never been written. Very few people know. Wayne Suarez knows because he was sitting right next to me at the time. But in the very, very beginning, it may have been 1990. No, it had to be the very beginning of 1993. George Brightman came down to visit the original members of Ghost Cigar.
Right.
And I was working on the wrappers in Chateau La Fuente. We already had one crop, and we're working on our second crop. And I used to make some cigars. They weren't big cigars. I think it might have been like a 42 by 6 or 40 by 6 or something like that, 42. I had a couple of cigars in my pocket, and I was sitting on the end of the table, and Wayne was right to my right-hand side, and there was about 10 manufacturers sitting on the table, and George was about 4 seats away. And of course, everybody was smoking their cigars. And I lit a cigar up after dinner that was, you know, it was a prototype cigar. It was a regular Fuente blend, let's say a Hemingway blend or whatever. And it just had a wrapper from Chateau de la Fuente. And we were in Puerto Plata at this restaurant. And George from a distance, I mean, think about 10 gentlemen smoking their own cigars, a lot of smoke in a small room. George from about 4 seats away, pretty far away, more than 6 feet, you know, probably more like, yeah, at least 8 or 10. He goes, "What are you smoking?" I said, "No, nothing. It's just one of my cigars." "No, what are you smoking? Let me see. What are you smoking?" "That's an Habano. You got that's an Habano. Let me see it." "No." "And what are you smoking?" This and that. And George kept on and on and on. And George was very, very close during the whole project. I think he coined it Project X from Planet 9. And
Yep.
it goes back. He was involved with the development every size. But I remember that I gave him a cigar, and I said, "George, what, you know, this is something that I'm working on. Whatever you do not tell anybody, please, because, you know, it's not developed yet. It's something that's on the process, and I'm working on it." And you know, George kept quiet for a couple of months, and then he couldn't hold back anymore, and he told Gordon Mott. Next thing, I'm getting a call that a gentleman named Michael Frank is going to come investigate what we're doing. And then after that, all shit hit the fan. So
That's exactly right.
yeah, but you know, that's telling you what kind of palate George has, and knows that he, from a distance, he smells something that wasn't Dominican, that wasn't Nicaraguan, that wasn't Honduran, but there was something a little different in the air, and he was able to detect that. And I've never seen anything even similar to that ever happening in my lifetime with any tobacco man, and that was amazing. Sometimes I ask myself if Wayne had given him a hint or Wayne had told him something, because the only one that knew what I had in my pocket was Wayne Suarez. But I know George is just amazing when it comes to that. And all through, I called George for advice all through the project when we're making the packaging, when, you know, the sizes, the original sizes of Fuente Pasex were all classic sizes. And George told me stick to the classics, and was great advice, because the industry had changed. What was once a Churchill 7 by 47 was now 7 by 52. It was all over the place. Anything. They name us any size, they would give it a classic name, shape, known, and so forth. And you know, they were Rothschilds were what we call Robusto's a day, and George said stick to the classics and everything. So George is a big part of the success and the very beginning, and he was there on the ground. He was the first one. That photograph that has become iconic of my father and I, George Brightman was there trying to hold some light, because there was absolutely no light. We tried to take photos inside the barn. It was a total disaster. My hat was flying off. There was a lot of wind. There was no good light. And Rico was trying to get a photo. And after the fact, we went out to tobacco fields, and it was very dark. It was very dark, and George was trying to hold that, or whatever you call the big umbrella, you know, the reflection, try to get a little light on our face. And magic happened. That photograph was taken, not on a professional camera, one of the Rico small camera that he said, "Listen, I got a couple of shots left." And that's where everything started from. That's why the photo took a lot of work. We had to do a lot of Photoshop, because you couldn't even see my face, only part of the face, because it was dark. So it evolved little by little, and George was involved with the whole thing, and Birthplace of a Dream.
That's
I
right.
remember we're sitting at Jacaranda, and we're talking, and Enrico was saying, you know, Fuente family had a farm, E-I-E-I-O. And, well, these are true stories, and that's what this program is about. It's about sharing your heart, your life. And George was there, and he coined a lot of things. George he was very much involved with the entire project, and I'm very grateful. So it's a real big privilege for me to be here and share this moment with George and everything. And I hope his memory serves him well, because I know he has a great memory. You know, nobody just named him the Pope, he earned it. So good to see you, George. You're looking well, man, and God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very kind. I appreciate that. That's all very much as I remember it. There's one other thing. You know, I remember how everybody looked when at that day in Puerto Plata, where you were coming in and I was actually leaving. All those guys were there, and I said, "Oh, wait a minute! Is this Project X from Planet 9?" Because I smelled it. I saw that. Remember, it was a Petite Lancero in your pocket, the first size made with that beautiful pigtail. It was so gorgeous, and I was like, I smelled it. I was like, "What is that?" And all these people turned and looked, and you were like, "Damn it! You know, don't say anything. You know, no, the cat's out of the bag." It was so underground at that point. And then I remember a couple visits later, we were on our way. You were actually taking me back to the airport to fly home from Santiago, and we were talking about, you know, how to name the brand. Remember that? And we were discussing, and I was saying, well, you know, think about the characteristics. I was just spitballing ideas for you, and I said, you know, what are the qualities of the cigar? And I used the word opulent, right? You remember? And so the thing is that we just went on because we were always talking about, you know, stuff like that. And he calls me later on in the middle of the night, I think, and said, "Man, I went home and looked up. I was trying to look up opulent, and I came across Opus, and was the inspiration." And I was just like blown away. I was like, "Oh my God!"
It was opulente. Yes, we talked about it. We see the word a lot in soap operas here. It means richness and so forth. And that's what, you know, as far as richness, but it had a different connotation. And I remember I was looking for a word because it started out after it was Project X for a couple of years.
Right.
And then I wanted to pay tribute to my father, Carlos Fuente, father and son, because we had so many Arturo Fuente Hemingway, Arturo Fuente Don Carlos, Arturo Fuente Chateau Fuente. And I thought it was important to separate this from Arturo Fuente. And I started with Carlos Fuente. And we started with 2 C's, you know, with working with our graphic artist, Samantha Snyder. I started around because it was Project X. We knew it was after 3 years, it was Project X. I mean, that was our baby. That was the X. It was the X. And we thought about it. We're Seva X, Special Selection X, all these things. And when George says, you know, opulent X, I say opulent, yeah, but it's too long. Opulencia, right. It's too long. And I started looking at the thesaurus. I started looking at this, and right under the word opulence is the word opus, and it was described as your brainchild, your masterpiece, your work, your greatest work. And I said, but this is the perfect name, but you know what, people are not going to pronounce it. What they're going to think, you know, it doesn't sound like a cigar. Opus X, Opus X, Opus X, Opus X. And at that time, I said, "Oh shit, Opus X! It sounds like sex."
Exactly.
Because everything is related to sex sells, you know, genes and all these things. Because it was at that time, and yeah, it was. We go back a long ways, absolutely. And you know, that story has been recorded over and over. It's in the documentary that James Orr did about you know, and so forth. But it's been 25 years since the cigar was launched, George.
Yep.
It'll be 25 years. Actually, it'll be 25 years on November the 18th this year. We launched it in New York City, just in Manhattan, because you kept calling me up and he said, "When's the cigar coming out?" I said, "No, it's coming out. I'm waiting for the packaging to be delivered. It's not right. And, you know, I wanted a little bit more embossing and the color and the red. I wanted it so." And it was back and forth. And I remember that it was causing a lot of problems because with the ratings and so forth, that we were at in Philadelphia for one of Robbie's event, and Marvin says, "You know, your son, you know, this and that. He's always saying he's going to come out. Does this cigar exist or not? Because this and that." And my father, being how he is, very simple man, he said, "Marvin, I guarantee you that in November, I'm shipping the cigars to. My son doesn't have the boxes and the packaging ready. I'm going to ship it in a paper bag, but I give you my word." I said, "No, this," and I said, "Holy shit, man." I got to, do something. And this is why we started with the slide top box.
Yes.
Because we didn't have the box, we didn't have the label complete, so I couldn't put a label. But I had to get the cigars out because my father promised Marvin. And I called the retailers. I said, please, we're going to change the box next month. So please do not sell the cigars by the box, because historically in the industry, if you change your packaging, you lose your brand. It's like it confuses people. So I asked the people, sell them 2 at a time. And, because you're going to be getting a new box and everything's going to change. So the only thing the cigar had was really with the band. And I remember I got a call from Bruce and from Madison Avenue.
At Arnold's.
And, Bruce says, Carlito, I said, you don't know what's going on. I was like really scared shitless. He says, there are grown men from Wall Street who's taking their lunch hour who are here and standing in line all the way across the corner to get 2 cigars at a time. I got the same call, from George Vasquez and this, and from Vinny. And it just, the 5 or 6 stores, it was something that was unheard of in the cigar industry. And those are things that to me, I just want to come to the conclusion that is God sent. That doesn't happen. And especially in a family, humble family without the resources to build a brand like that, for it to happen through Cigar Aficionado and the middle of the boom and the magic to happen, it was meant to be. And I really believe that this gift or this vehicle that was loaned to us or given to us was just to give us the opportunity to meet people all over the world, to develop Chateau de la Fuente, to see the extreme poverty and needs and children around the farm, because George could remember how those kids, every time we arrived, came running up and, they asked for money or they asked for something, and there was no schools in the area, no electricity, because George was there in the very beginning. And, I think that Fuente Opesex was, it was that vehicle that made us aware of the community, and we began Cigar Family Charitable Foundation.
Yes.
And now it's recognized as, it's one of the greatest example of social and corporate responsibility. And it was all built through cigar lovers. It was all done by cigar lovers, every bit of it. And the most important thing, that it all started with this little joke of Project X from Planet 9. It's turned into a phenomenon that was never expected.
Yes.
And George, this show is about you, George Brightman. It's not about me, but I'm talking about us, because we were there together, hand to hand. And I just want the whole world that never knew that. I want to make sure that the world knows your involvement and the appreciation I have for all you contributed to this brand that has become a phenomenon when you think about it, for a small family business. So, very blessed.
Well, the rest of us are blessed that we got it, that you pursued it, and that your dad, bless his heart, also let you run with the ball. I still think it's one of the most extraordinary things that's happened in our lifetime in the industry. I think about it, Carlito. You and I, we're basically in our 5th decade in this industry. And there are not a lot of guys that can say that now. And the changes that we have seen are extraordinary. But that brand was a pivot for everybody, for the whole cigar world, because all of a sudden non-Cuban cigars were elevated in a way that really hadn't happened before, and it certainly put the Dominican Republic on a world stage in a very, very different light. I want to touch on one thing that you said that was a little like a casual remark there, and that is that Enrico, that day when we were there shooting the original pictures, which became the way the world identified with Chateau de la Fuente and Fuente Opesex, that moment that we caught in the fields after a long day of trying to achieve a particular image was so perfect, because what it caught, that moment that Enrico managed to record was that look between you and your father. And to me, that is, it was like he caught lightning in a bottle. It was such a beautiful moment. And the fact that it endures, you know, that it's a poster that the world gets to see. And I love it. That day will live forever in my memory, and mostly because of all the emotion that we had that day, struggling to, you know, to make good on our efforts, and then that happened just like that. It was really, we were blessed. Same
Absolutely.
thing.
No, we worked very hard that day. I remember Enrico was frustrated. We didn't have electricity at the farm, so we couldn't use lights. Everything had to be natural. And it was something spontaneous. The sun had gone down. It was dark. And Enrico says, please, Don Carlos, just go out to the field 1 minute. My father said, no, man, I don't like this shit, man. I got to work. You know, this photo stuff is not for me, and blah, 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 and that. And we all went to the fields, and Enrico started joking around and said some really funny things and caught my father just like, nephew started laughing, and he plopped that photograph. I mean, that was never planned. That was something that was spontaneous. It was never intended to be used. And it's something that happened. There were only 4 human beings in that entire plantation that day. And during that shot, there was 4 people.
At that
Enrico
moment.
Barone, our brother who sadly passed away, who took that photo, who I met through George Brightman. George Brightman was there, and my father and I. That's 4 people, and that's, when you think about it, shit, George, that's pretty strong, man. That's pretty strong. It goes back in cigar history, man. That's pretty strong. You were there.
We were lucky that day.
Yeah.
We were lucky that day, and man, I think about all the great things that have happened following the success of that. It's, you know, it's hard to acknowledge how much it changed things, the success of that for everybody, and it's just we're all so lucky, but you know. Again, I have to say that it stems from your work ethic and your father's. You guys, I was laughing the other day when I heard you say that, because I remember when I come down to the factory and we go in your office and you're at the desk, you pull open and you'd be sorting through the cigars, like, what are we going to smoke? What are we going to smoke before we get in the Jeep and drive down to the farm, right? And your father turned to me and he goes, oh, we should come visit more often. You know, when you're here, he gives out cigars like candy, but normally it's easier to get a tooth from the mouth of my German Shepherd. I loved it.
Yeah, you remember that. Yes, yeah. My father
priceless.
always said that. He says, man, I can't get one of those cigars. It's easier to pull a tooth out of my German Shepherd. And let me tell you something. I used to be very cautious when I went near my dad's house to visit him with his German Shepherd. But it's absolutely true. Yeah, absolutely true.
That's great. I love it. You know, Jeremiah, I wanted to tell you something.
This is perfect. I can just sit back and listen for hours to this.
Jeremiah, I wanted to share something with you that I was thinking about, and it's sort of in the same era. So sorry for the people who are listening that you know are like tired of hearing about the cigar boom, but you know, one of the things that happened after, you know, there was this explosion. Everybody wanted to be around the cigar industry, and they didn't just want to know, okay, what kind of wrapper was it, what's in it, where to come from. They wanted to know the people that were there. So, of course, Cigar Aficionado, you know, there were explosions of events, but we had to have special things. We had to have things that were more unusual. And so one of the things that we did was to create this luncheon series, and I will never forget this as long as I live. We had a panel, and so we did these luncheons at the plaza, and, you know, we would get extraordinary people, but your dad was there to be a part of a panel. Benji was on it, and the thing is, Heller came. Your grandfather was there. And I got to tell you, man, I love that guy. Every minute that I spent with him was like a blessing. I treasured every moment that I could be with him. But
ladies and gentlemen, that's when the plaza actually burned down. My grandfather was probably messing around with his torch or whatever it was and burnt the fucking hotel to pieces.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise
he came
me
up.
at all.
What?
You got cut off. You got cut off for about a minute there. What were you saying?
So what I'm saying is that at this luncheon, your grandfather was there, and when it was all over, and it ran long, and everybody was going home, everybody had stuff to do, a friend of mine that I invited to come, who was one of my old friends in the business, Jerry Edelman, came up to your grandfather. He came up to Heller, and he said, I think you knew my father in Cuba before the revolution, and your granddad didn't miss a beat. He looked at him, and he said, no, young man, I knew your grandfather. And he started telling him a story about what they had been doing in Cuba in the 40s and early 50s before the revolution.
Now, George, this is where I have to stop you.
No.
Hey, I've known your grandfather in his early days in the stories. I thought the same exact thing. Wait a minute, don't go too far.
Yeah. But no, it was great. It was perfect. And Jerry left walking on air. I promise you, he never had a better day. And it was that encapsulated everything that I love about the business, the brio, he was such an awesome guy. So we were, just blessed to have that time with him.
Thank you very much. Thank you. No, it's nice to hear those stories, and to be honest with you, it feels nice. I lost my father. He was very, very young. So my grandfather stuck around for a while. He was very present, and life goes on, and we end up being the seniors. Sometimes a little younger, sometimes a little bit later. But in any case, that's it. It's our show now, and we're going to have to carry, like Carlito says, we're going to have to try to follow the footsteps, although we'll never fill the shoes. But whatever the case, we got to keep pushing this diamond further and further and further out into space, and make sure that we leave it for our children just that little bit further than we received it from our parents.
That's right.
Parents.
I agree.
George, I got a good one for you. You know that Gordon Mott and I, we talk a lot, and you and I had a conversation the other day. So I want to clarify this. This is interesting. So I'm talking with Gordon one day about pallets and things like that. And he says, without a doubt, George Brightman. So he says to me, you want to know how good George is? We gave him at Cigar Aficionado one time 10, coated cigars. And we asked him to smoke them. And I said, out of the 10, how many did he get? Well, Gordon says he got 9. So talking with George about that, George says, to be honest, I got 10 out of 10. So what happened that day?
Okay, I'll tell you this. They called me in and gave me some story about the idea that they had given him to the photographer, and that he returned them without the bands, and they needed to know what was what. Can you hear me? Am I coming through, or am I lost?
Yes, we hear you.
Loud and clear.
So they had him laid out, and I went through and I said, okay, that's a Partagas number 9 from the deep, which had that beautiful Cameroon wrapper. I said, this is a Punch Rothschild. That's a Monte Cristo number 2. That's a Hoyo Excalibur. All these different things. And so when it was over, they said, okay, thanks, that's it. And I was like, what do you mean? They go, hey, you're off the tasting panel. I'm like, what are you talking about? And they go, because there's no such thing as a blind test for you. You just got 9 out of 10 right. And I said, no, fuck you. I got 10 out of 10 right. And they said, no, that's not a Punch Rothschild. That's a Hoyo de Monterrey Rothschild. And I said, same thing. Call the factory right now. When they're rolling them, they don't know what they're going to call them. They sort them and put them in different colored boxes, but it's the exact same cigar. So it's 10 out of 10. They laughed and said, yeah, get out of here. But I was like, I want my record to stand.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. But he's right. The Punch Rothschild and the Hoya were the same cigar.
Exactly the same cigar. But so, you know, that led to many other circumstances. I'll tell you, this is a story that some people, there were only a few witnesses to, but it's, we were in Mexico on our way to Cuba for a tasting. This is around the time that everybody was going crazy for the Partagas Lusitania. And well, we got in a disagreement about whether or not cigars that were made that went to different markets had a different characteristic, and they could be identified that way. And I said, "Oh, I can tell the difference between, you know, a Hoya de Monterrey Epicure that was meant for London as opposed to Paris or Hong Kong or something like that." And the head of Cuba Tobacco at the time, but no, it's not possible. It's not true. So I said, well, listen, we can do it all. We can do. You pick the cigars, and we'll all, you know, we have all the people necessary here to assemble. We have Edward from London, and you know, we had
Edward Sahakian.
Exactly. So we had all the people necessary, and they agreed to do a blind. They were going to choose cigars in blindfold. So they were going to come from one from London, one from Geneva, one from Hong Kong, and one from Cuba. And I was going to say which cigar was meant. And here's the thing. They backed out of the agreement later, but at the time they said that's not possible. And Gordon leaned forward and said, if George said he can do it, he can. And I was like, all right, thank God I made a believer.
All right, George, it's time to pull you on the grill, and we're going to, ladies and gentlemen, Melanie's hot spot. Melanie, put him on the grill.
Uh-oh.
Yes, so we have some really hot questions for you, George. All right, so here's the first one. And you've only got 2 minutes to answer it, okay? So you got
okay.
Your answer. All right, so what is your warmest, fondest memory of your career?
Wow. You know, there are a lot of moments, but one I would say was time that I spent with Carlito and his dad and Fred Zanaboni. And another was my times with Zino Davidoff in Switzerland, in Geneva. And those were extraordinary. And quickly, I'll end with this. All of them involve life lessons every bit as much as they learned anything to do with tobacco.
Oh, that's awesome.
Great man.
That's very nice, George. Thank you. Very nice.
All right, so here's another good one. What is the most embarrassing moment of your career?
Ha! Well,
George, are we there yet?
Yeah, no. You're kidding. This is fine. I'm happy, but I'll tell you one, and I'll edit it really quickly. It's very simple. There was a time when we were doing a cigar aficionado event at the convention, at the trade show, and I was one of the people that had to speak. And you know, as all of us in the industry are wont to do, we were up late the night before, you know, sharing stories and smoking cigars and just enjoying ourselves in general. I think I rode the newspaper truck back to the hotel that day. But anyway, I had to talk before all these people collected that day, and I was up there. You know, I ran up to my room and threw water on my face and cleaned up and came back down to do this. And I think I was probably about 2 minutes into speaking, you know, to this group, whatever. And we, you know, without just like on automatic. And then all of a sudden I looked, and I don't know who was in the front row. But somebody was like like that and giving me this look, and all of a sudden I popped to and said, "Oh yeah, right. I have to pay attention. I really have to do this." And so I snapped out of my fog and focused on the matter at hand. And if there hadn't been someone that I knew in the front.
That was getting good.
George, you cut off again. We lost your voice. We can see you, but we lost your voice.
I'm sorry, I think I lost the audio.
There you go. You're back.
There you go.
Thanks, appreciate it. Okay, so I hope that wasn't too revealing.
All right, Melanie.
All right. Okay. And the last one, what would be your best advice or life lesson that you have learned that you would like to share with the audience?
Don't go into the cigar business because you think it's the road to riches. Go into it because the rewards are about the lifelong friendships and the things that you can build. We're all of us have traveled a lot of the world and made extraordinary friendships, and the dividends that they pay are much, much more important and much more valuable than what you can put in your bank account. Unfortunately, that's why I'm broke, but I still believe that it's absolutely true. That it's one of the most rewarding businesses spiritually, psychically, emotionally. It's one of the most phenomenal businesses to be in. And the people give all the time.
That's beautiful. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. George Brightman, this is exactly why we do, what we do, why we are, what we fight for the reasons we fight for, and why we decided to put this show on air and to bring to you, ladies and gentlemen, every Tuesdays and every Fridays, this show, so that you can truly understand and feel what's going on behind that magical smoke that you're enjoying, which is called the cigar. Beautiful. Thank you very much, George. Jose, back to you.
George.
Yes, sir.
Without a doubt, you have been very involved in the industry. And you and I talk about the past, we talk about the present, we talk about the future. With all the things that are going on right now, from your point of view, how do you see the industry in the next 2 or 3 years?
Well, let's set aside the cloud that's over us right now with quarantine and closures and things, and put our mind to a positive aspect that we're all going to get out of this with our health, and that eventually businesses are going to be able to open their doors again and welcome their customers through. How many of them have suffered in the interim is we won't know yet. But what I think is more important for us to be aware of is the possibility of more severe sanctions from the FDA. The deeming rules, the substantial equivalent, and the damper that could put on the market and our creativity is the real hazard. And I think it's what we've seen overall is that our industry is adaptable, and that we will survive. But we've met a lot of challenges, smoking bans, the onerous taxation, all kinds of efforts to demonize us, and to make this something that it's harder and harder to get your hands on, and more difficult to enjoy. I think that there's no question that the industry will prevail. It will survive. Because people are always going to love the opportunity to share a cigar and to get the benefits of what it does, how it brings us together. Whether we're going to be able to do that as openly, as freely, and as cheaply as we do right now remains to be seen. I believe that we're under significant pressure, and it's going to take real unity from people in the industry to confront the challenges that are there, because we can't afford to fight amongst ourselves.
No, definitely not.
It captures a lot of us.
George.
Yes, sir.
This is a question from Emma. She can't appear because she's cooking, but she wants to ask this question to you. How much does the cap on the cigar, in your opinion, give away, even though the taste and the strength and the fact, does it give away for you? Where do you think the cigar is coming from?
No, before trying it.
Before trying
Yeah.
it.
Oh, yeah. But looking at a cigar, and it isn't only the cap, although that's the first thing that you look at. But looking at a cigar, most of the time you can tell where it came from. The cap, in some instances, in my opinion, the cap, like if we're talking about a Cuban cigar, the cap tells which factory it came from. But in general, looking at the construction of a cigar, you can say that's a Dominican cigar, that's a Nicaraguan cigar, that's a Honduran cigar. And, you know, when you take away the cap, then the first thing you do, put that cigar in your mouth for a cold taste. Before you light it, before you do anything else, that usually tells you the rest of the story. What kind of tobacco it is, whether it was made properly, if it was fermented. Good question, though.
That's great. Now, George, it's a good answer, says Carlito. Yes. we have a custom to get people on the show and ask questions from the audience. We have a gentleman, which I believe you know, called Dallas. Dallas, why don't you shoot your question to George?
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Hi, George. How are you?
Great. How are you?
Awesome. Thank you. I'm certainly belated. Happy birthday to Papo.
There you go.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dallas.
Oh,
You're
my
welcome.
goodness. Dallas, thanks for reminding us. Ladies and gentlemen, it was Carlito Fuente's birthday. What was it, 2 days ago, if I'm not mistaken? Or was it yesterday, Carlito? Time's going back to, 2 days ago.
Before yesterday.
So I think we should all sing happy birthday to Carlito. Huh?
Not necessary.
Happy birthday
to you. Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday. Come on, guys.
Carlito.
Thank you, man.
Feliz cumpleaños.
Hey, Carlito, may you have many years of good health, many years of happiness, many years of success, and may you continue leading our industry with the hands of iron and the genius which you've been doing it for so many years. We love you very much. All right, Dallas, you're up.
Sure, thanks. So George, I wanted you to go back to when you first started getting into the industry, when you were down there in DC and started out with Georgetown. What intrigued you about cigars and provoked your interest to enter the industry, please?
Well, thank you. That's a nice, good question. I can tell you this. First of all, I backed into it because I was trying to work on paintings in my portfolio to get a scholarship to art school. And I was working on something that I was basically destroying every time I took the brush to the can. I liked where I had gotten to, and then I said, no, I'm ruining this. So I got to take a break. And I went to my local cigar store, which was a Georgetown Tobacco, close to my house. And I bought a cigar because that's how I was going to calm myself down. And a friend of mine, a guy that I'd gone to school with, another artist, was the manager of the store. And I'm like, what are you doing here? And one thing led to another, and I ended up going to work there. But I can tell you this, I fell in love with cigars at a much younger age than that, because when I was a kid, my first job as I was probably 9 or 10, I was a magician, and I used to go, that was my hobby, and I used to go to this shop downtown in Washington between the Capitol building and the White House called Al's, and eventually I got a job there. But I used to pester this guy who was like one of the customers, a real character. He was a cigar smoker, and he did some tricks with cigarettes mostly, not with cigars. But I'll never forget the guy. I begged him and begged him and begged him to teach me this one trick. And he did finally. And so I said, okay, let me have a cigar so I can practice. And he goes, screw you, kid, get your own cigars. Right? So I was like, okay. And I left Al's, and I went, because every day when I would walk from my father's office to where Al's was, I would go by National Pipe Shop. And so I went in National, and I said, you know, I want to buy a cigar. And they said, screw you, kid, get out of here. You know, I was hearing a lot of that day. And I said, no. I work down at Al's, the magic shop, and I just want to practice, you know. So they ended up giving me a broken cigar, which I fixed and started trying to practice. But I was looking around that place, and I was like, man, this is the coolest place I've ever seen in my life, man. The pipes, you know, they had hookahs and they had the cigars. Everything looked, it was just like stepping into, I don't know, Aladdin's cave or something. It was so amazing. And that place stuck in my mind. I was like, I want to be here. I just loved it. I loved the smell, the taste. So after that, every time on my way there, I would stop in, I would mooch cigar boxes from them and go through all of this stuff, and pretty soon everything I owned was stored in cigar boxes, and I was like the half mascot of that place. We had all these, anyway. But
Last question: what's your favorite Fuente and why?
I knew somebody was going to ask that, and that is the toughest question to answer.
The one in your hand.
Well, yeah, it's always the one you're smoking. There's no question about that. But I will tell you this: over the years, for me, smoking a Fuente Hemingway is like a time machine. It takes me back to the late 80s and to the time when, you know, I was running Davidoff, and I had them in the Hemingway lineup in my humidor, and right alongside them I would always put the Ashton cabinet, so you could see this beautiful Cameroon and this gorgeous Connecticut shade in these shapes. They were just lovely. But smoking one of those is a time machine. However, for me, I go back and forth between an Añejo and a Don Carlos, and going, this is the greatest thing ever. There's like, if somebody said to me that you had to pick a desert island cigar, I would probably end up saying something like a Don Carlos number 4, because I could pack a lot of them into a small container, you know, and just always have them. I know your dad always had them in the pocket of his Guayabera. That's it, you know. To me, it's a magic cigar. The proportion is ideal. The flavor is great. But
It is a great cigar.
There we go. We got the voice off you, George. Oh no, this is terrible. We're gonna miss all the interesting part of it.
Sorry, I lost you again.
Yeah, George, we lost your voice there for a couple of minutes.
I apologize.
Don Carlos. Go after the Don Carlos. You were packing them in a small place to have in
Yeah.
your pocket.
Having a Don Carlos, you know, that would be the greatest thing, you know, and like I said, you know, so many of them. But the thing is, if I was trapped on a desert island with only my Don Carlos, I think eventually I would have to dive in the water and see if I could swim to the DR so I could get me some Opus X.
Well, it's always nice to hear that one of the greatest palates in the world would smoke his last cigar being a Don Carlos. You know what? That would probably be my choice as well, George.
Exactly. Prize Cameroon.
And if it's not Meerapfel, George, it's not
Cameroon.
There you go. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's that time of the day. We got Benoit's Baked. Benoit, can you hear us?
I hear you, Jeremiah. Hi, everybody.
Hello,
Hey,
Benoit.
what's up?
Hey, Benoit. Happy Fuente Friday, my brother.
Happy Fuente Friday. Happy birthday, Fuente Friday, Carlitos.
Thank you so much, Benoit.
Happy birthday to you. 30 years. What a young man you are.
All right, before Benoit goes with his show today, we want to make sure that everybody understands that if you're not 21, you leave the show. And for legal reasons, we are broadcasting out of Switzerland, and those legal reasons are Benoit's mouth. So Benoit.
All right. So first, I would like to apologize to Chinese people and French people today. Ready to go. Today, special for you, Carlitos, a good story, a good one. So, it's a story of a French woman, has a grocery in France, and you know, the typical French people from the village don't prefer to stay in this place. don't like anything from out of France. Friends is friends, that's the best. So this kind of woman. And then 2 weeks ago, a Chinese restaurant place just next door. So she is a little bit, a little bit mad about it. And then one day, the boss of the Chinese restaurant come in his grocery and say, "Bonjour, madame. I would like to have dog food, please." And then the woman say, whoa, wait a moment. How can I trust you? How can I know if you don't buy dog food to serve to your customer? So please go back with your dog. Okay, madam. So he leave, and 50 minutes later, he's back with his dog. So the woman say, okay, dog food is gone. And then the day after, the Chinese guy is back and say, "Bonjour, madame. May I have cat food, please?" Whoa. Wait a moment. How can I trust you? How can I know that you're not buying cat food to serve to your customer in your Chinese restaurant? So please come back with your cat. So 15 minutes after, the Chinese guy is back with the cat. Okay, cat food is gone. And then the day tomorrow, the guy is coming back with a whole dish of brown food. I say, "Bonjour, madame." And directly the woman say, "Oh, it's very kind of you, thank you, but I don't really like strange food." So she take a spoon and then taste and say, "Pah, very disgusting. It tastes like shit." And then the Chinese guy looked the woman and say, "Yes, may I have toilet paper, please?"
Holy shit.
All right, Benoit.
Oh my God.
Out of your fucking mind.
Unbelievable.
Much, Benoit. Thank
Sorry
you.
again for Chinese and French people.
All
Carlito,
right.
again, happy
Back-
birthday to you, and I wish you a very nice day for you all, and see you Thursday. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. You
All
take
right,
care,
bye,
my
brother.
Yeah.
All
Bye-bye.
right. All right, guys. Time is slowly running out, but back to you, Professor. We still got a few minutes. We can broadcast.
George, this
Yes,
might be
sir.
a tough. This might be a tough one, but you can think it over. In your career, you have met, I would say, every cigar personality, every master blender, everybody, the who's who of the cigar industry. One way or another, you have had some kind of contact. Who has been the person in our industry that you have met that has impressed you the most, and why?
Wow. That's a loaded question. So thanks for aiming that gun at me. But here's what I will say. It's hard to top someone like Zeno Davidoff. But I will tell you one other person that I met who impressed me, but maybe not in the same way. And that's Ramon Cifuentes. Ramon, I was pretty young. I was still pretty new in the business when he brought Partagas back to the United States market via the General Cigar. They were originally made in Jamaica. They also had glorious Cameroon wrappers. But he was this really imposing figure and very aristocratic. And I remember being in awe of him and the things, he would just let these things drop. And I'm sure that to him I was invisible, because I'm just a little punk kid running, working in a cigar store. but he was amazing. But I will follow that up with something that's very relevant. For the 150th anniversary of Partagas, you remember that back in the 90s when they had made this extraordinary collection of cigars, and we were all in Cuba. So General had their version, which today is extremely sought after. What's left of that limited run of cigars, but the production from Cuba was done by three rollers. And we were there in the Partagas factory to meet them, and we sat down and talked. And I'll never forget Celestina, I think, was one of the three, the only woman of the three who had actually worked on making Partagas cigars back in the 50s under Don Ramon. And I said to her, what would you say if we could get Don Ramon back here? If we could have him come visit the factory today and look and see what you're making, how beautiful these cigars are. And she looked at me and she said, "I'd be worried he'd fire me." Because she had a few more stronger things to say, but the idea was no. We don't need that kind of guy in the factory again. And that really struck me that there was a lesson. We've evolved. We've come a long way, and what Guillermo and his dad did at the Leon factory, for La Aurora. How Carlito's dad raised his kids and ran his factory. There's a new age in terms of how we treat our workers and our family that produce these wonderful things.
I concur, George. Ernesto Fuente was an incredible man, and he was striking. He was, and he was a perfectionist. And I heard many stories similar to that in the Dominican Republic, how he would accept nothing less than perfection. He was an incredible man. I concur.
Yeah, a taskmaster and a disciplinarian, but driven, and an incredible. He was an artiste in his way.
I think it's you don't hear that every day. I mean, we're going back in time, and I think that Carlito might have a memory with George that maybe he hasn't spoken about as the last part of this. So. There's things you say, there's things that you hear, but Carlito, I know there's something that you would like to say to George.
Uh-oh.
Well, there's so many. It's hard to pick one out. There's so many, but George did something that it really blew me away in a positive way. That I thought it was impossible. George came to me in the very, very beginning of Fuente Pasex and said, "Listen, I got an idea. How would you like to pair your cigars with Cavassier?" And I started laughing at him. I said, "What?" I said, "You're crazy. Cavassier, they don't even know who we are, man. We're just a little, a humble family and so forth." And the next thing I know, George had put together this big campaign with Cavassier. I started doing events with Cavassier. It was Mr. Coppola. Francis Ford became a spokesman, and he endorsed our products, and I think that was something that was very, very special. The first time that we were pairing with an international, well-known brand, and I think that helped us a lot. And that lasted for several years. We would do events together. So, I mean, that's something that I thought it was that George. Come on, George. I know that you could talk up a storm, but I think you're overdoing this one. This is not a possibility. Well, it was, and it was a very special moment, and George pulled it through. And George said something, he gets it done. He wouldn't just say something, and that was just amazing. That's a special memory. I don't know if George remembers, but it really was very special.
Yeah, the best part about that is that we actually improved cognac sales by pairing it with Fuente Opus X. Gave them a lift.
I certainly hope so. I certainly hope so.
Ladies and gentlemen, we promise you behind the scenes, we deliver behind the scenes. It's that time of the day. Time has run out. We could spend hours, days, probably weeks sitting here and continuing this conversation, but we're just going to have to pull George right back onto the show some other time. George, it was an honor and a pleasure. It was one exceptional show. Thank you very, very much for having joined us and our audience today. Thank you, George.
Well, thank you for having me.
I have a message from Liana, especially Cynthia. They both send their love. They love you very much. And I'm sure Cynthia has a lot of great memories with you also. So it's really good to reminisce and to remember what I call the good old days. And we'll just keep making good days together.
That's exactly right. We tell Cynthia, I still remember her and I, it's like we were the youngest, we were the kids on the show floor. People were like, you can't come in here and be like, no. So listen, you know, she's a jewel to me. I love her.
Yeah, and you remember Cynthia when she first started going out, traveling, visiting accounts and everything. So, I mean, Cynthia was just a young girl right out of university. And so you guys go back a very long time also.
There's a message from Cynthia. It says, I can remember you, George, when we were the youngest kids in the business, walking around the RTDA shows. George is always dressed to the max. I enjoyed doing a 100th event with George at Draper's in DC. We have decades of memories. Ladies and gentlemen, it's that time of the day. Happy Fuente Friday. Enjoy the weekend. And remember, take care of yourself and of others. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you all.
Thanks, George.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, George. Stay well, stay healthy. God bless you.
Thank you as well. Thank you. Appreciate it.